Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
A big warm welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Isn't it funny how life works out sometimes? In the last week, I've learned I will be heading to Denver, Colorado to speak about podcasting next February. And a guest a few days ago, Brett from Notion, he was from Colorado. And indeed, today's guest, Chris Richter, Senior Vice President and Global Security Services at Level 3 Communications. And guess where he's from? You got it. Maybe the universe is telling me to move to Denver, Colorado. However, I wanted to tackle a very serious subject today. And it seems that on a regular basis we're hearing about malware attacks, data breaches, hacks and phishing attempts, almost on a daily basis now. I mean, Equifax is a great recent example of that. But this constant stream of attacks is responsible for what tonight's guest calls threat intelligence fatigue. Now, I don't want to reveal too much about his findings or today's conversation, so buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way back to Colorado so we can speak with Chris Richter, Senior Vice President and Global Security Services at Level 3 Communications. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Chris. Back in May, I spoke with Chief Security Officer Dale Drew at Level 3 about security vulnerabilities and ransomware attacks in healthcare. But before we begin, can you tell the audience a little about your role at Level 3 and also a little about yourself?
Absolutely. And Neil, thanks for having me on the program. I really appreciate it. I am Senior Vice President Global Security Services at Level 3. I've got responsibility for our global and professional security services line of businesses. I've been in IT a little over 30 years and in IT security specifically for a little under 20 years. I've held a number of different leadership positions in a lot of IT consulting and technology companies, primarily service provider related companies. I work with a lot of companies, IT organizations specifically, helping them adapt from premises-based infrastructure to cloud-based, network-based security models, and also helping them with their security policies and compliance postures through the transformation process. It's an interesting world. It's ever-changing, and Level 3 is definitely, as one of the world's leading network services providers, is in a good place to deliver services and help customers transform from prem to cloud-based security models.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can both agree that maintaining the security of critical and sensitive data now is no small feat for global enterprises. But for anyone that's listening that has limited knowledge around our cyber reality across that digital landscape, can you offer a brief overview of why even secure fiberoptic networks can be a risk and the dangers and threats that are facing organisations every day, but many are blissfully unaware of?
So, a great question. Whenever data travels globally or across numerous hops, it's subjected to a number of different techniques for siphoning off that data. You can trust an organization, potentially, if you choose to get your data from point A to point B securely. But if it's in the clear, all bets are off. Even fiber can be tapped, and data can be siphoned off through a network tap. But if it's encrypted, even though it's tapped, it would, depending on the encryption algorithm, it could be very difficult to decrypt the data. The work effort would be enormously large. But I'll never forget a conversation I had with a customer about 15 years ago. And as we were talking about private networks, this is with a large national bank. We walked out to the window, looked at the building across the street, and he goes, "In that building is a gateway, a network gateway. I don't know who's going into the cage. I don't know who's taking their laptop into the cage and plugging into the router and siphoning off data." So even though there are private networks in the world, private does not mean secure. And he was absolutely correct. A private network is not a secure network unless the data on that network is encrypted, because you don't really know where the data is hopping around and where somebody has an opportunity to tap into either fiber or copper at a relay, a gateway, or a router.
That's so true, and so many people now are completely oblivious to this. And Another thing, really, I mean, hackers are becoming more and more sophisticated and adept at intercepting and diverting data in transit. But why do you think that many enterprises are actually overlooking those certain aspects of security, such as employee training, governance, or even the need to protect data while it's actually in motion?
The companies that I speak with, Neil, are all mostly aware of what they have to do, the due diligence and due care that they need to follow. They are severely constrained by budget problems and personnel issues. Personnel issues meaning not enough qualified and not enough bodies in general to perform things like security training or do adequate vulnerability scanning and patch management. As we move more into the digital age, digital business, the problem is only expanding. I know we're going to probably talk about IoT at some point, but IoT is greatly expanding the attack surface, which complicates the problem. So it's a personnel and funding resource issue more than anything else. And companies are forced then to prioritize and triage what risk areas they want to prioritize.
Another one of the reasons I invited you on the show today was after I recently read how you pointed out that threat intelligence fatigue is causing problems too. I mean, can you expand a little on this? I think it was a great article that I read where you were quoted in, but I could just expand on that a little.
Absolutely, Neil. There are a lot of threat intelligence companies out there. The market is just bursting with all sorts of threat intel offerings, promising different solutions to customers. The problem is that a lot of that data is strategic in nature. It's good data, but it doesn't really pinpoint the problems within a customer's environment. And even if it does, there is the potential for that data to be riddled with false positives. And again, given that these companies and these enterprises are limited in resources and time and funding, there's so much threat intelligence data coming to them through these different offerings. They don't have the time to siphon through it to find those critical alerts that apply specifically to their business and their internal IP addresses. And so that causes a lot of fatigue. And I think there's a big disappointment in the market in general over a lot of threat intelligence solutions because they are creating more work than they are net benefit to these organizations.
Now, as a man that's still got IT blood running through these veins, I've got to ask another question as well. I mean, how do you help global businesses address those increasing security threats, but also without sacrificing network performance? Because we've all seen, anyone that's got an old PC that had Nortons on it will tell you how a solution can actually hinder your network performance. But I'm curious, how do you get around that?
Well, at a sort of a philosophical level, we strive to simplify security and reduce the complexity of cybersecurity, and in the process of simplifying and reducing the costs, making the whole security ecosystem for customers more efficient and therefore more effective. So to improve the efficacy of a cybersecurity effort, you have to reduce the complexity because complexity is really a hacker's best friend. The more complicated an environment, the more exposed external IP addresses, the broader the attack surface, the easier it is to distract these overburdened companies and break into them and take their data. And we've seen a lot of recent headlines to that effect. So the level 3 philosophy for our product line is to reduce complexity and reduce costs, and at the same time improve performance. So services like our encrypted wave offering, for example, provides high-speed encryption over fiber links by using high-speed encryption techniques on our backbone. Our adaptive network security product line moves UTM capabilities and next-generation firewalling onto our backbone, where those firewall hubs are connected directly to a high-performance, high-speed network, removing the burden from the customer environment, reducing costs, and improving performance. And we're also providing simplification of security by providing very accurate and pinpointed threat intelligence data that relates specifically to our customers' IP addresses, not the entire internet. and the entire world of threats. It relates to things that are happening directly between the internet and the customer environment. So our whole philosophy is basically focused on improving performance, reducing complexity, and reducing costs to ultimately improve security.
And I think many businesses have limited budgets, and they're also faced with a myriad of options when it comes to security now. So I also have to ask, what should enterprises actually be investing in when it comes to security? For example, is it encryption or threat intelligence?
I think the very first investment companies need to make is with a good security framework, which begins with a risk assessment, thorough examination of the company's data or the organization's data. A good risk assessment will include classification of data, because you don't really know what sort of security architecture to put in place or how much to spend on security if you don't know what it is you're securing. And ultimately, the bad guys are trying to get into your network to take your data. The data is ultimately at the very core of the circle of what we're trying to protect here. A risk assessment will lead to a security policy and a security governance program, which must be endorsed by senior management. And that is step one before a single dollar is spent on technology or additional personnel. So that's what they should be investing in. And they may find that they can reduce their security spend. A lot of companies do reduce their security spend after a thorough risk assessment and a change in security policy, because they realize they can do away with a lot of data that just isn't needed anymore. Having old data sitting around in itself can be a liability. They may discover in a risk assessment that the data that's valuable and they do need to keep is spread out across too many different points of presence, and it needs to be consolidated with strong access control methods. So there's instead of throwing technology in boxes and solutions at the problem, we need to understand what the problem is through a risk management driven approach.
Now, hardly a week goes by at the moment without hearing about another big cyber attack or another big hack. Equifax in the last couple of days is a great example of that. But what would you say are the biggest security threats businesses are facing today?
I think Equifax is a great example. Problems a lot of companies are facing. There are so many devices in an organization that must be monitored and kept up to date with current patches. And that whole process has to be driven not only by a good policy framework, but also ensuring that there are individuals on hand who can do the work. The number of devices that can provide access to critical data that are exposed in some way to the internet or to unauthorized access is probably the single biggest issue. And I think we're going to see some big developments coming forth, not only with encryption, but also with stronger access and authentication methods.
Now, you did mention earlier in the show there about IoT. So I've got to ask, what does IoT play in the security landscape today, in your opinion? Or equally, how the proliferation of IoT is compounding these issues that we're talking about?
Well, a recent example, I conducted a roundtable with a number of critical infrastructure companies that are very focused on SCADA systems. And it's alarming how many SCADA systems utilizing IoT, because they're lightweight, they're relatively simple to deploy, they can provide a vast amount of helpful data that can reduce the cost of personnel to be out in the field and in different places. But at the same time, connecting IoT to critical infrastructure systems presents a risk for obvious reasons. The security risk is not only does it increase the attack surface, but IoT devices are used for a couple of things. One, they can be used as part of a botnet to launch DDoS attacks. We've seen that happen on numerous occasions, especially with the proliferation of Mirai and its use with IoT devices. But IoT also can be a target of a ransomware attack or some other type of attack, where if the IoT device is so critical that if it gets shut down, it can create serious issues. So we're seeing the emergence of IoT not only as an attack source, but also as the victim itself.
Now, we've already talked about that technology is advancing at a phenomenal rate and threats are advancing at a phenomenal rate, but then so are the bad guys too and their use of this technology. So how can a typical enterprise actually hope to stay ahead of that continuously evolving threat landscape?
The again, I keep going back to a good security framework.
Yeah.
Our best defense is to make sure that we understand what the bad guys are after, and we do that through classification of data, and then begin layering on the appropriate security controls to protect that data. And when I say appropriate, I mean the right dollar spent, the right technology, and the right number of personnel to manage the technology that protects that data. We also have to be mindful and aware that the world is changing very rapidly. The hacking community is growing. We have to be aware that the number of people on this planet of roughly 7 billion people who have access to high-speed internet is growing at a phenomenal clip. And most of that growth rate is happening in third world nations. We're also seeing that we have to be aware of the fact that where groups of hackers that emerge tend to grow the most rapidly in economically depressed areas with institutions of higher learning nearby, combined with high-speed internet access. So if you take all of those things into consideration, the number of potential attackers targeting our infrastructure is only going to increase. The problem is only going to increase. So we have to be very vigilant with the way we grant access to our critical data and what data we want exposed to the internet in general.
Now, I'm sure you guys must have a ton of online resources for anyone listening who wants to find out more about what we've spoken about today. So before I let you go, can you just point the listeners in the direction of where they can educate themselves further about what you're doing at Level 3, and also how they could contact a member of your team if they have any further questions?
One of the best sources of information, Neil, is a site that contains blogs and articles written by Level 3 security team members as well as third-party team members, specifically focused on security, encryption, networking, SD-WANs, a number of topics, but a lot of them are security related, and that is netformation.com. That's netformation.com. And I also encourage your listeners to follow me on Twitter. I am my handle is Richter on Cyber, Richter on Cyber.
Fantastic. Well, a huge thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. I really appreciate it because, like you have said on numerous occasions, there really is a bad case of threat intelligence fatigue out there. But equally, we're all aware of our responsibilities. So the fact that you've been able to come on and actually educate us all a little bit means the world. So a big thank you for coming on.
And the pleasure was mine, Neil. Thank you.
I think that the concept of threat intelligence fatigue is something that is very real and I can completely relate to. I mean, as hackers become more sophisticated and adept at intercepting and diverting data in transit, enterprises are guilty of overlooking certain aspects of security, such as employee training, governance, or the need to protect data while it's in motion. So I really enjoyed speaking with Chris tonight and for him taking the time to come on and share his experiences and his insights with us. But I've got to ask you guys now, let me flip it over back to you. I mean, do you work in cybersecurity? How does your organisation educate its staff to protect them from themselves? Please share your thoughts and insights by contacting me, as always, at techblogwriter@outlook.com or tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. And I also need your help on something, because as we're approaching the 350th episode, I'm also thinking of shaking up the format of the show a little. But as this is your show too, I want your help. I mean, do I keep these catchphrases? Do you cringe and want me to retire it? This is your chance to point me in the right direction. So please, any suggestions, any feedback, send them over to me. But I'm out of time now, so until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.